On the morning of October 18, 1943, in the frozen forests outside Smolensk, Sergeant Claudia Reeves lay motionless in a sniper's nest she had constructed 20 hours earlier, her breath forming tiny crystals in the air that threatened to give away her position with each exhalation. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and through her scope she could see the German observation post exactly 473 meters away, where soldiers moved with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves safe behind their fortified lines. They had no idea that their sense of security was about to become their greatest vulnerability, so that the woman watching them had spent 3 weeks studying their patterns, learning their routines, and preparing a deception so subtle that it would transform their own tactical doctrine into a trap. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would become one of the most studied examples of psychological warfare in sniper training manuals, demonstrating how a single soldier with patience, intelligence, and an understanding of human nature could turn the enemy's own assumptions into their downfall, proving that the most effective weapon in warfare is often not the rifle, but the mind that wields it. The journey that brought Claudia Reeves to that frozen forest began 9,000 kilometers away in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she had grown up as the daughter of a steelworker and a seamstress, in a neighborhood where every family knew hardship, but also knew community. Her father, Marcus Reeves, had worked at the Midvale Steel Company, one of the few facilities that employed black workers in skilled positions, and he had taught his daughter from an early age that precision and patience were the keys to survival in a world that would constantly underestimate her. Her mother, Eleanor, had worked 16-hour days at a textile factory while raising 4 children, demonstrating a kind of endurance that Claudia would later recognize as the foundation of her own resilience. The family lived in a modest row house on Federal Street, where neighbors shared what little they had during the Depression years, and where young Claudia learned that community survival often depended on individual sacrifice and collective strength. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Claudia was 17 years old and working at a munitions factory that had recently begun hiring women to fill positions left vacant by men joining the military. She worked on the assembly line producing shell casings, a job that required extraordinary precision and attention to detail, qualities that her supervisors quickly recognized. The factory produced an average of 12,000 shell casings per day, and any defect could result not only in rejection of the product, but potentially in catastrophic failure in the field, a responsibility that weighed heavily on every worker. Claudia distinguished herself by maintaining a defect rate of less than 0.03%, compared to the factory average of 0.2%, earning her a promotion to quality control inspector within 6 months. She would walk the assembly lines with calipers and measuring instruments, checking dimensions to tolerances of thousandths of an inch, developing an eye for detail that would later prove invaluable in an entirely different context. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed American society overnight, and like millions of others, Claudia felt compelled to contribute more directly to the war effort. However, the realities of racial segregation meant that her options were severely limited. The United States military maintained strict segregation policies, and opportunities for black women were virtually non-existent in combat or combat-adjacent roles. Black men could serve in segregated units, often relegated to support and labor roles, while women of all races were excluded from combat positions entirely. The contradiction was stark. The nation was fighting against tyranny and oppression abroad while maintaining institutionalized discrimination at home, an irony that was not lost on Claudia or the millions of African Americans who nonetheless sought to serve their country. It was through a chance encounter at a community meeting in early 1942 that Claudia learned about an unusual opportunity. A representative from the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, was quietly recruiting individuals with specific skill sets for specialized training programs. The representative, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had herself broken barriers as one of the first Asian American intelligence officers, was looking for people who could think strategically, who possessed unusual patience and precision, and who could operate independently in hostile environments. The OSS was more progressive than the regular military in some respects, willing to utilize talent regardless of race or gender if the skills were exceptional enough, though these progressive attitudes were often driven more by pragmatic necessity than ideological commitment. Claudia approached Margaret after the meeting, and their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Margaret explained that the OSS was developing partnerships with allied nations, including the Soviet Union, and that there were opportunities for Americans with specialized skills to serve in advisory and training capacities. The Soviet military had already deployed women in combat roles, including as snipers, with remarkable success, and they were interested in expanding their programs with input from allied specialists who could bring different perspectives and training methodologies. It was an unusual arrangement, born of the strange alliances that war creates, where ideological opponents become partners against a common enemy. Margaret was frank about the challenges. Claudia would face discrimination not only because of her race and gender, but because she would be an American in a foreign military system. The training would be brutal, the conditions harsh, and the survival rate for snipers was among the lowest of any military specialty. Despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, Claudia volunteered. She spent 3 months in an OSS training facility in Virginia, where she learned basic Russian language skills, studied Soviet military doctrine, and underwent preliminary marksmanship training. The instructors were surprised by her natural aptitude with rifles. She could maintain absolute stillness for hours, a skill she had developed during those long shifts inspecting shell casings, where any movement could disrupt precise measurements. Her breathing control was exceptional, allowing her to time shots between heartbeats, and her mathematical mind could calculate windage, elevation, and lead with remarkable speed. One instructor, a former Olympic shooter named Robert Chen, Margaret's cousin, wrote in his evaluation, "This recruit demonstrates the most natural sniper aptitude I have observed in 15 years of marksmanship instruction. Her ability to combine physical stillness with mental alertness is extraordinary, and her patience exceeds that of shooters with a decade of experience." In May of 1942, Claudia was part of a small group of American specialists who traveled via military transport through Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and into the Soviet Union, a journey that took nearly 3 weeks and covered approximately 13,000 kilometers. The group included engineers, communications specialists, and a handful of individuals destined for specialized combat training. They arrived in Moscow in early June, just as the Soviet Union was mobilizing every resource for what would become the largest military conflict in human history. The scale of Soviet mobilization was staggering. Factories were producing thousands of tanks monthly. Entire cities were being relocated eastward, away from the advancing German forces, and millions of civilians were being integrated into military production and support roles. Women were being recruited not just for traditional support positions, but for direct combat roles, including as pilots, tank drivers, machine gunners, and snipers. Claudia was assigned to the Central Women's Sniper Training School, located in a converted monastery outside Moscow. The facility trained approximately 200 women at a time in intensive 3-month programs, and by the time the war ended, it would graduate more than 2,000 qualified snipers. The commandant was a legendary figure named Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who had already achieved over 300 confirmed victories and had become a symbol of Soviet military prowess. Pavlichenko was a demanding instructor, expecting absolute dedication and perfection from her students, but she was also keenly aware of the psychological pressures her snipers would face. She understood that sending a woman into combat, particularly in a role that required working alone or in small teams deep in enemy territory, meant overcoming not only the enemy, but also the skepticism and sometimes hostility of one's own side. The training regimen was more intense than anything Claudia had experienced. Days began at 4 in the morning and often extended past midnight, with classroom instruction in ballistics, meteorology, camouflage observation techniques, and tactical planning interspersed with practical exercises in marksmanship, fieldcraft, and survival skills. The students learned to calculate bullet drop over distances exceeding 1,000 meters, to read wind patterns from the movement of grass and leaves, to construct concealed positions that could withstand close inspection, and to remain absolutely motionless for 12 hours or more while maintaining constant observation of target areas. They studied the psychology of their targets, learning to identify officers and specialists by behavior and equipment, and they practiced the mental discipline required to take a human life from a distance, a psychological challenge that many trainees found more difficult than the physical demands. Claudia excelled in every aspect of training, but she distinguished herself particularly in tactical planning and psychological analysis. During one training exercise, she was tasked with eliminating simulated targets in a defended position. Rather than attempting to achieve victories through direct shots, which would immediately alert the defenders and force them to take cover, she deliberately created near misses that appeared to be ineffective fire from an incompetent or poorly equipped sniper. The defenders, believing themselves to be facing an inferior threat, became careless in their movements, allowing her to study their patterns and vulnerabilities. Only after 2 days of observation did she begin achieving simulated victories, by which point she had identified every important target and could predict their movements with remarkable accuracy. The exercise evaluators were so impressed that they asked her to present her methodology to the entire school, and her tactical approach was incorporated into the advanced curriculum. The concept that would later become known as the fake miss strategy emerged from Claudia's understanding of human psychology and organizational behavior. She had observed during her factory work that when people believed they were safe from danger, they became predictable in their routines, developing patterns that could be exploited by anyone patient enough to study them. She also understood that the German forces of that era placed tremendous emphasis on technological superiority and tactical discipline, creating a mindset where they often underestimated opponents who appeared to be using inferior equipment or demonstrating poor skills. A sniper who appeared incompetent, firing shots that consistently missed by small margins, would be dismissed as a negligible threat, not worthy of the disruption and resources required to mount a serious response. This dismissal would lead to complacency, and complacency would create opportunities for a patient hunter who was willing to sacrifice immediate results for long-term strategic advantage. After graduating at the top of her class in September 1942, Claudia was assigned to the 6th Guards Army, which was deployed in the Smolensk region, an area of intense fighting where German forces were attempting to consolidate their positions before the onset of winter. She was paired with a spotter named Yekaterina Volkov, a former schoolteacher from Leningrad who had lost her husband and 2 sons in the early months of the war. Yekaterina was 20 years older than Claudia, with the weathered face of someone who had endured unimaginable grief, but her eyes remained sharp and her mind was quick. The 2 women developed an immediate rapport, communicating as much through gesture and expression as through their limited shared language. Yekaterina's Russian was native, while Claudia spoke it with a noticeable accent and limited vocabulary. But in the field, such limitations mattered less than trust and competence. Their first month of deployment was dedicated to observation and reconnaissance, establishing patterns and gathering intelligence without engaging enemy forces. They would move into forward positions under cover of darkness, carrying their weapons and equipment along with enough supplies to remain in position for days at a time. Claudia's rifle was a Mosin Nagant model 1891-30, fitted with a PE 4-power scope, a weapon that was reliable but technologically inferior to the German Karabiner 98K rifles with their 6-power scopes. The Mosin Nagant fired a 7.62 by 54 mm round, powerful enough to achieve decisive results at ranges exceeding 800 meters, but the rifle was heavy, weighing approximately 4 kilograms without ammunition, and the bolt action required careful manipulation to avoid creating noise that might reveal a sniper's position. During those first weeks, Claudia and Yekaterina observed a German-held sector that included a fortified observation post, several machine gun positions, and a command bunker that served as a local headquarters for approximately 200 soldiers. The observation post was elevated on a hillside, providing excellent sight lines across the surrounding terrain, and it was staffed around the clock by rotating teams of observers and communication specialists. Claudia noted that the staff changed shifts at predictable times, that certain individuals always appeared in the same locations at the same times, and that their movements suggested a high degree of confidence in their security. This confidence was not unfounded. The German forces controlled the surrounding area, had established multiple defensive lines, and possessed superior artillery and air support. Any obvious threat would be met with overwhelming response, making it suicide for a sniper to attempt aggressive action. It was this reality that crystallized Claudia's strategy. She explained her plan to Yekaterina through a combination of Russian words, diagrams drawn in the dirt, and hand gestures. She would begin by taking shots that appeared to be genuine attempts, but would deliberately miss by margins small enough to be attributed to poor marksmanship or inadequate equipment, rather than intentional misdirection. These shots would occur sporadically over several weeks, never frequent enough to justify a major response, but consistent enough to establish a pattern. The German forces would come to regard the sniper fire as an annoyance rather than a threat, something generated by an incompetent or poorly equipped enemy sniper who posed no real danger. This perception would lead them to maintain their routines, become slightly more careless in their movements, and eventually reveal patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited decisively when the moment was right. Yekaterina understood immediately. She had seen enough combat to recognize brilliance when she encountered it, and she also understood the patience required to execute such a plan. She nodded slowly, then pointed to herself and to Claudia, and made a gesture that encompassed weeks of time. It would require extraordinary discipline for both of them, weeks of discomfort and danger, of watching targets and deliberately choosing not to engage them effectively, all while gambling that the enemy would react precisely as predicted. There was also the risk that their own commanders would lose patience, would interpret the lack of confirmed victories as failure, and would reassign them or alter their mission. Success would require not only executing the tactical plan, but also managing expectations and perceptions on their own side. The first deliberate miss occurred on September 23, 1942. Claudia had established a position approximately 600 meters from the German observation post, concealed in a thicket of brush that had been carefully arranged to provide both cover and a clear shooting lane. She had been in position for 14 hours when a German observer stepped out of the fortified position to smoke, a habit she had noted on previous observations. The man stood in a predictable location, his body language relaxed, completely unaware that he was being watched through a telescopic sight. Claudia controlled her breathing, calculated the wind at approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the west, adjusted her aim point and slowly pressed the trigger. The shot cracked across the distance, and the bullet struck the wooden post approximately 30 centimeters to the left of the target's head, sending splinters flying. The German soldier dove for cover, and within seconds, the observation post erupted in activity. Claudia and Yekaterina remained absolutely still as German soldiers scanned the surrounding terrain, looking for the shooter's position. After approximately 20 minutes, when no additional shots came, the activity gradually subsided. Through her scope, Claudia could see officers examining the impact point, and she could read their body language even at this distance. There was alertness, certainly, but also a kind of dismissiveness, a sense that this was not a serious threat. One officer made a gesture that Claudia interpreted as frustration or contempt, waving his hand as if to dismiss the incident. This was exactly the reaction she had hoped for, acknowledgement of the threat but dismissal of its seriousness. Over the following 2 weeks, Claudia fired 7 more carefully planned shots, each one a deliberate near miss that maintained the illusion of an incompetent sniper. She varied the margins of error, sometimes missing by 20 centimeters, sometimes by 40, always maintaining an accuracy that suggested genuine attempts rather than harassment fire. She also varied the timing and locations of her shots, never establishing a pattern that would allow the German forces to predict when or where the next shot would come. Each shot generated a brief period of heightened alert, but as the pattern continued without any actual casualties, the responses became more perfunctory, more routine. She could observe through her scope that soldiers were spending less time in cover after each shot, resuming their activities more quickly, demonstrating the exact erosion of caution that she had predicted. Meanwhile, Yekaterina was documenting everything. She recorded the timing of each shot, the target selected, the German response, and the subsequent behavior patterns. She sketched maps showing movement patterns, noting which individuals went where and when, identifying by appearance and behavior who held what roles. She noted that one particular soldier, a tall man with distinctive posture, whom they came to call the careful one, always moved deliberately and took cover effectively, suggesting professional military experience. Another soldier, younger and less disciplined, whom they called the wanderer, had a habit of stepping outside to walk the perimeter at irregular intervals, a dangerous practice that revealed either bravery or foolishness. There was a communications specialist who always emerged at precisely 900 hours to check external antennas, and an officer who came out every afternoon at approximately 1500 hours to smoke and survey the surrounding terrain with binoculars. After 3 weeks of this pattern, Claudia observed something crucial. The soldiers were beginning to expose themselves more freely during the periods when she typically did not shoot. Her shots had occurred at various times, but she had deliberately avoided certain hours, and the Germans were unconsciously learning to feel safe during those hours. This was the behavioral conditioning she had sought to create, the development of an expectation of safety based on patterns. More importantly, she noticed that the careful one and several other experienced soldiers were beginning to adopt the same careless behaviors as their less disciplined comrades, a sign that even training and experience could be eroded by repeated exposure to what appeared to be an incompetent threat. During this period, Claudia and Yekaterina endured conditions that would have broken most people. They spent up to 3 days at a time in concealed positions, lying motionless in freezing temperatures, eating only cold rations, unable to move enough to maintain warmth, relieving themselves where they lay because movement was impossible. They dealt with rain that soaked through their clothing and made their camouflage positions muddy, with snow that threatened to reveal their outlines, with insects in warmer hours that they could not swat away. Claudia developed frost damage on 3 toes of her left foot, a painful condition that would trouble her for the rest of her life, and Yekaterina suffered from severe arthritis that was aggravated by the cold and immobility. Yet neither woman complained or suggested abandoning the plan. They had both seen too much suffering, lost too much, to be deterred by physical discomfort, and they both understood that success in their role could save the lives of hundreds of their comrades by providing intelligence and eventually removing key enemy personnel. In mid-October, Claudia received intelligence through her unit commander that a senior staff meeting would be held at the German command bunker. The exact date was not known, but intercepted communications suggested it would occur within the next 10 days and would involve officers from multiple units gathering to coordinate defensive preparations for winter. This was exactly the opportunity Claudia had been preparing for. A concentration of important personnel in a predictable location at a time when their guard would be lowered by weeks of exposure to apparently ineffective sniper fire. She began planning the operation with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to inspecting shell casings, considering every variable, every contingency, every possible outcome. The plan required 3 concealed positions, all established well in advance, and camouflaged so thoroughly that they could withstand close inspection. The first position, which she called the decoy, was located approximately 700 meters from the observation post, but positioned to create the impression that shots were coming from a different direction than the actual firing position. The second position, the primary, was her actual shooting location, situated approximately 473 meters from the command bunker, with a clear sight line to the entrance and the surrounding area. The third position, the escape, was a fallback location from which she could provide cover fire if their withdrawal was detected. Each position required days to prepare, with careful attention to sight lines, escape routes, and the placement of natural materials to create concealment that would not appear artificial. On October 16th, reconnaissance reports confirmed that the meeting would occur on October 20th. Claudia and Yekaterina moved into their primary position on the evening of October 17th, carrying supplies for 5 days and prepared to wait however long was necessary. The temperature was dropping steadily, with forecasts suggesting it would reach 20 degrees below zero by the end of the week, and the first significant snow was expected within days. These conditions were brutal, but also advantageous. Soldiers would be focused on staying warm rather than on security, and any tracks or signs of their presence would soon be covered by snow. The night of October 17th, as Claudia lay in her carefully constructed hide, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her father teaching her to measure precisely, her mother demonstrating patient endurance, the factory workers who had shown her that women could perform any task if given the opportunity. She thought about Margaret Chen, who had believed in her potential when military regulations said she had none. She thought about Ludmila Pavlichenko, who had proven that women could not only fight, but could excel in roles traditionally reserved for men. And she thought about Yekaterina, lying quietly beside her, who had lost everything yet continued to fight with a determination that inspired Claudia daily. October 18th passed slowly. Claudia maintained observation throughout the day, documenting all activity, noting the casual behaviors that confirmed her analysis had been correct. Soldiers moved without excessive caution, following their routines, occasionally glancing toward the direction of previous sniper fire, but without real concern. The Wanderer made his usual irregular patrols. The communications specialist checked his antennas at the expected time. The smoking officer emerged for his afternoon survey of the terrain. Everything was proceeding exactly as the weeks of conditioning had established. Yekaterina tapped Claudia's arm gently and pointed, indicating a supply truck that had arrived and was being unloaded. The supplies included extra firewood and what appeared to be better rations, small details that suggested preparation for hosting visitors. October 19th brought increasing activity. Claudia counted 17 vehicles arriving throughout the day, most of them staff cars that suggested officer transportation. She observed soldiers cleaning and organizing the command bunker area, posting additional sentries, and generally preparing for something important. The observation post maintained its normal operation, but she noticed slightly increased vigilance, a natural response to the arrival of senior officers. However, this heightened awareness was directed toward obvious threats like partisan attacks or artillery strikes, not toward the sniper who had demonstrated weeks of incompetence. The psychological conditioning remained intact. The commanders were worried about serious threats, not about the ineffective shooter who had been missing shots for weeks. On the morning of October 20th, Claudia began final preparations. She had 3 rifles positioned, her primary Mosin Nagant with scope, a backup rifle without optics, and Yekaterina's rifle prepared for spotting and backup fire. She had calculated exact ranges to multiple points using triangulation and reference points marked during previous observations. She had assessed current wind conditions, noting a slight shift from the prevailing westerly to a more northwesterly direction at approximately 6 kilometers per hour with gusts to 12. She had determined that light conditions would be optimal between 1000 and 1400 hours, with the sun angle providing adequate illumination without creating excessive glare. She had reviewed every aspect of her plan with Yekaterina through their combination of limited shared language and detailed sketches, ensuring they both understood exactly what would happen and when. At 0930 hours, staff cars began arriving in greater numbers. Claudia identified at least 12 vehicles, suggesting a gathering of perhaps 30 to 40 officers. Through her scope, she could observe their behavior, the relaxed manner in which they greeted each other, the way they moved without concern for concealment or security. These were men who felt safe behind their defensive lines, protected by their technological superiority and military doctrine. They embodied the confidence of an army that had conquered most of Europe, that had defeated nation after nation through superior tactics and equipment. The irony that this very confidence made them vulnerable would probably never occur to them. At 1000 hours exactly, the meeting appeared to begin. Claudia could see through her scope that the area outside the command bunker had cleared, with all personnel presumably inside for the briefing. She settled into absolute stillness, controlling her breathing, calming her heart rate, entering the mental state that her training had cultivated. Yekaterina lay beside her with spotting binoculars, ready to call corrections and observe results. They had agreed on a simple communication system. Hand signals only, no words, to maintain absolute sound discipline. At 10:33 hours, the first group emerged from the bunker. Claudia could see 3 officers, distinctive in their uniforms and bearing, accompanied by 2 soldiers who appeared to be adjutants or staff assistants. The group paused outside the entrance, and one of the officers lit a cigarette, a small moment of human normalcy in the context of industrialized warfare. Through her scope, Claudia studied them, making final calculations, preparing for the sequence she had planned. Then, deliberately, she aimed her rifle not at any of the officers, but at a point approximately 1 meter to their right, and she fired. The bullet struck the wooden frame of the bunker entrance with a loud crack, sending splinters flying. The 5 men dove for cover, disappearing into the entrance within seconds. Claudia immediately worked her rifle's bolt, chambering another round, but did not fire. This was the beginning of the sequence, the first move in a tactical chess game she had been planning for weeks. As she had predicted, the initial response was rapid, but relatively limited. Soldiers emerged from various positions, taking cover and scanning for the shooter's position, but their movements suggested more irritation than serious concern. This was, after all, just the same incompetent sniper who had been missing shots for weeks, now demonstrating the same poor marksmanship at the worst possible time. Claudia waited exactly 7 minutes, enough time for the initial alert to begin subsiding, but not enough for complacency to fully return. Then she fired again, this time deliberately missing a soldier who had incautiously moved between positions. The bullet passed close enough that the soldier certainly heard it, and he scrambled for cover, but again the response was measured rather than overwhelming. She could observe officers emerging briefly to assess the situation, and their body language suggested frustration rather than fear. One officer made the same dismissive gesture she had seen weeks ago, as if annoyed by this persistent but ineffective nuisance. Over the next 90 minutes, Claudia fired 8 more times, each shot a carefully calculated near miss, each one reinforcing the pattern of incompetence that she had established over the previous weeks. She varied her targets and timing just enough to maintain the appearance of genuine attempts while never achieving a result. The German response followed a predictable pattern: initial scramble for cover, brief security sweep, gradual return to normal activity. By the 5th shot, soldiers were barely bothering to take full cover, often just ducking momentarily before resuming what they had been doing. By the 8th shot, she observed 2 soldiers actually making mocking gestures toward the direction they believed the fire was coming from, a dangerous level of contempt that confirmed her conditioning had been successful beyond her expectations. At 1245 hours, approximately 2 hours after the meeting had presumably begun, officers started emerging from the bunker in larger numbers. Claudia counted 23 individuals who were clearly officers or senior specialists, plus additional staff and security personnel. They gathered outside the entrance, some smoking, others consulting maps or documents, demonstrating the natural human need to step outside after hours in a confined space. More importantly, they were demonstrating exactly the careless behavior she had cultivated through weeks of patient conditioning. These were experienced military professionals, yet they were standing exposed in a group, presenting target opportunities that would horrify any security specialist, all because they had been trained through repeated experience to believe that the sniper threatening them was incompetent. Claudia had spent 3 weeks deliberately missing. She had endured discomfort, cold, hunger, and danger while restraining herself from achieving results that would have been easily within her capability. She had fired dozens of shots without effect, accepting that her superiors might consider her failed, that her commanders might question her abilities, all in service of this single moment. Now, surrounded by targets who believed themselves safe, she would demonstrate what a truly competent sniper could accomplish when the enemy's guard was completely lowered. She adjusted her aim point, compensating for the 6 km/h northwest wind, accounting for the slight downward angle of her shot, timing her breathing to the natural pause between heartbeats. She selected her first target, an officer who stood slightly apart from the main group, distinctive in bearing and uniform, positioned where his fall would create the maximum psychological impact. Through her scope, she could see him clearly, could see him gesture as he spoke to companions, could see him completely unaware that he was being observed by someone who had spent weeks studying his every pattern. She exhaled slowly, let her breath settle, and in the natural stillness that followed, she gently pressed the trigger. The distance was 473 meters. The bullet left her rifle at approximately 828 meters per second, traveling the distance in slightly less than 0.6 of a second. In that brief interval, before the sound of the shot could even reach the target area, the officer collapsed. The effect on the group was instantaneous and devastating. Men who seconds before had been standing casually, now scattered in every direction, seeking cover, their training overriding the complacency that had developed from weeks of conditioning. But Claudia and Yekaterina had anticipated this reaction, had planned for it, and now they executed the second phase of their operation with the same precision that had characterized the first. Yekaterina, observing through binoculars, had already identified the next priority target, and she indicated the position with a quick hand signal. Claudia adjusted her aim, found the target attempting to reach cover, and fired again. The precision was the same, the result identical. 7 seconds had elapsed since the first shot. Panic was now evident in the movements of the remaining personnel, who were discovering that the cover positions they sought were themselves exposed to the sniper's line of sight. Claudia had chosen her shooting position specifically for this advantage. From her angle, several of the natural cover positions were actually in direct line of sight, a geometric reality that the defenders had never considered because they had never faced a competent sniper from this direction. The training exercise evaluators had asked Claudia to document her methodology, and she had written, "The key to tactical deception is patience and consistency. An enemy will believe what they are shown repeatedly, especially if what they are shown confirms their existing assumptions about their own superiority. Once a pattern of behavior is established, it becomes exceptionally difficult to break, even when circumstances change. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a feature of human psychology. We are pattern recognition machines, and we trust patterns we have personally observed more than we trust abstract warnings." The German forces outside that command bunker were now learning this principle in the most visceral way possible, as the incompetent sniper they had dismissed for weeks revealed herself to be something entirely different. Over the next 4 minutes, Claudia achieved 6 more decisive results. Each shot was separated by intervals of 30 to 50 seconds, enough time to chamber a new round, acquire a new target, adjust for any changes in conditions, and fire with the same precision that had become her trademark. Yekaterina called corrections in quiet Russian words that Claudia had learned during their months together, and she kept detailed notes of each result for future reporting. The German response was now fully mobilized, with soldiers laying down suppressive fire toward the suspected sniper position, but their fire was directed toward the decoy position Claudia had prepared, not toward her actual location. She had deliberately constructed the decoy to be obvious once someone looked carefully, knowing that under stress, soldiers would fire at the first plausible location rather than conducting careful analysis. At 1251 hours, approximately 6 minutes after her first effective shot, Claudia ceased fire. She had achieved 8 decisive results, including 5 officers and 3 key specialists she had identified through weeks of observation. More importantly, she had destroyed the psychological foundation of security that the German forces had developed. They now knew that there was a skilled sniper with clear sight lines to their positions, but they did not know where she was located, how many snipers might be operating, or when another attack might come. The panic and confusion evident in their movements confirmed that the psychological impact was as significant as the tactical results. Claudia and Yekaterina remained absolutely motionless for the next 3 hours. They knew that the German response would be massive, that artillery would soon be bombarding the suspected sniper positions, that patrols would be searching the surrounding terrain. Their survival depended on remaining undetected until they could withdraw under cover of darkness. They watched as troops swept through the area where the decoy position was located, as artillery shells devastated the surrounding terrain, as commanders struggled to understand what had happened. The confusion was evident even at this distance. How had a sniper who had missed dozens of shots over 3 weeks suddenly achieved multiple precise results? Was this the same sniper or a different one? Had the previous shots been deliberate misses, and if so, why? The questions generated more confusion, and confusion generated mistakes. As darkness fell on October 20th, Claudia and Yekaterina began their withdrawal. They moved with extreme caution, covering approximately 100 meters per hour, constantly vigilant for patrols and observation posts. They carried everything they had brought into the position, leaving no evidence that could provide intelligence to the enemy. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and fresh snow was beginning to fall, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. They reached their own lines at approximately 0300 hours on October 21st, having been in constant operation for more than 60 consecutive hours, and they were immediately taken to a debriefing session with their battalion commander. Major Mikhail Volkov, no relation to Yekaterina despite the shared surname, listened to their report with evident skepticism that gradually transformed into amazement as he reviewed Yekaterina's detailed notes and documentation. He had been receiving reports about the ineffective sniper fire for weeks and had been on the verge of reassigning both women to different duties, believing that Claudia lacked the capability to perform at the level her training suggested. Now, reading the timeline and understanding the deliberate nature of the deception, he recognized that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a tactical operation that demonstrated patience, psychological insight, and strategic thinking far beyond what was typically expected of soldiers at any level, let alone from snipers operating independently in the field. The intelligence value of the operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Through their weeks of observation, Claudia and Yekaterina had documented detailed information about German defensive positions, troop strengths, routine schedules, communication patterns, and command structures. They had identified weaknesses in security protocols, gaps in defensive coverage, and behavioral patterns that could be exploited by future operations. They had also demonstrated a methodology that could be taught to other snipers and reconnaissance specialists, potentially multiplying the impact many times over. Major Volkov immediately forwarded their documentation to Army headquarters with a recommendation that both women receive recognition and that their tactical methodology be incorporated into training programs. Over the following weeks, intelligence reports from other sources confirmed the impact of the operation. Interrogations of prisoners revealed widespread confusion and paranoia about sniper threats, with soldiers reporting that they no longer felt safe anywhere within several kilometers of the front lines. Defensive routines had been massively disrupted, with movement now occurring primarily at night or under cover, significantly reducing the effectiveness of German observation and control. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact had spread far beyond the immediate area of operations, with reports indicating that soldiers across multiple units were now hyper-vigilant about sniper threats, even in areas where no actual sniper activity had occurred. The fear of unseen threats had become its own form of warfare, reducing morale and effectiveness across an entire section of the front. The German military response was equally revealing. Claudia's operation was discussed in captured documents as an example of Soviet tactical evolution, with analysts noting that sniper operations had become significantly more sophisticated and psychologically oriented. Training bulletins were issued warning soldiers not to become complacent even when faced with apparently ineffective enemy fire, and new security protocols were implemented requiring more rigorous defensive procedures. These changes had real costs. They required additional manpower for security, reduced operational efficiency, and created psychological burdens that affected morale. In essence, a single sniper team had forced the enemy to expend significant resources and accept operational limitations across a wide area, a return on investment that military strategists would study for decades. In December 1942, Claudia was awarded the Order of the Red Star, a significant recognition for a foreign volunteer, and her tactical methodology was formally incorporated into Soviet sniper training curricula. She continued operating as a sniper until she was wounded in March 1943, taking shrapnel from an artillery shell during a withdrawal operation. The wounds ended her frontline service, but not her contribution to the war effort. She was assigned to training duties, teaching her methods to new generations of snipers, and she later participated in liaison activities between American and Soviet military organizations. Her influence extended far beyond her personal achievements, as the tactical and psychological principles she had developed became standard components of sniper doctrine. The fake miss strategy, as it came to be known in training literature, represented a fundamental insight about human psychology and tactical deception. Traditional sniper doctrine emphasized immediate effectiveness, achieving results with every shot, demonstrating competence to both the enemy and one's own commanders. Claudia's innovation was to recognize that sometimes the most effective path to success requires temporarily accepting the appearance of failure, that the patience to forego immediate results can create opportunities for much greater long-term impact. This principle applied not only to sniping, but to intelligence operations, psychological warfare, and strategic deception across many contexts. It required confidence to execute, willingness to be misunderstood by one's own side, and absolute faith in one's analysis of enemy psychology. The technical aspects of the operation were impressive, but ultimately less significant than the psychological dimensions. Claudia's marksmanship was excellent, but not superhuman. Many snipers could achieve similar levels of precision given proper conditions and equipment. What distinguished her operation was the sophistication of her planning, the depth of her psychological analysis, and the discipline to execute a plan that required weeks of patience while enduring severe discomfort and accepting the appearance of incompetence. She understood that her enemy was not just the soldiers she targeted, but the assumptions and expectations that governed their behavior, and she crafted her operation to exploit those assumptions with surgical precision. Yekaterina Volkov continued serving as a spotter and reconnaissance specialist until the end of the war, participating in more than 40 operations and training dozens of new specialists. After the war, she returned to Leningrad and worked as a teacher once again, though the city she returned to had been devastated by the siege that killed approximately 1 million people, including her remaining family members. She maintained correspondence with Claudia for more than 30 years, and their letters, preserved in military archives, provide detailed insights into their experiences and reflections. In one letter written in 1956, Yekaterina wrote, "What we did was not about bravery or skill, though both were necessary. It was about understanding people, understanding what they fear and what they assume, and understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the rifle but the patience to use it wisely. Claudia taught me this, and I have taught it to hundreds of others. This is how we honor those we lost, by transforming pain into wisdom and wisdom into victory." The broader context of women's service in the Soviet military during this era is essential to understanding the significance of Claudia's achievement. The Soviet Union deployed approximately 800,000 women in various military roles during the conflict, including as pilots, tank crews, machine gunners, medical personnel, and snipers. More than 2,000 women served specifically as trained snipers, achieving an estimated total of more than 12,000 confirmed results. This represented the largest deployment of women in direct combat roles in military history up to that point, and it demonstrated conclusively that women could perform effectively in roles traditionally reserved exclusively for men, provided they received proper training and support. However, this progress was often driven by desperate necessity rather than ideological commitment, and many of these women faced discrimination and skepticism both during and after the war. Claudia's unique position as an African-American woman serving in the Soviet military added additional layers of complexity to her experience. She faced discrimination based on both race and gender, often from multiple directions simultaneously. Soviet society, while officially promoting internationalism and racial equality, harbored its own prejudices and biases. American military authorities, when they learned of her service, were often dismissive or hostile, viewing her as a propaganda tool or as someone who had betrayed her country by serving with an ideological opponent. Even among allies and comrades, she frequently encountered assumptions and stereotypes that she had to overcome through consistent demonstration of competence. The fact that she not only succeeded, but excelled in this environment testifies to extraordinary personal qualities: resilience, determination, intelligence, and an ability to focus on mission success despite social obstacles. The psychological toll of sniper operations deserves particular attention. While snipers achieve results at a distance, often without seeing the immediate human impact of their actions, they also experience combat in a uniquely personal way. Unlike artillery crews or bomber pilots who never see their individual targets clearly, snipers observe their targets intimately through their scopes, often for hours or days before engaging. They see faces, observe habits and mannerisms, recognize their targets as individual human beings with lives and families. This intimate knowledge creates psychological burdens that many snipers struggle with long after their service ends. Claudia spoke about this in a 1968 interview, one of the few public discussions of her wartime service. "I saw them as human beings, never just as targets. I knew their routines, their habits, which ones were careful and which were careless, which ones showed leadership and which showed fear. This knowledge was necessary for tactical success, but it also meant that every operation had a human face. I do not regret my service, but I have never forgotten those faces, and I never will." After the war, Claudia returned to the United States in late 1945, part of a general repatriation of American citizens who had served in various capacities with Allied forces. Her reception was complicated by the emerging Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Intelligence agencies questioned her extensively about her service, suspicious of anyone who had served with Soviet forces, and she faced challenges in obtaining employment and reintegrating into civilian society. She was not eligible for most veterans' benefits because her service had not been with American military forces, and the OSS, which had recruited her, was dissolved in 1945. Leaving her without institutional support, she worked various jobs, including as a precision machinist, quality control inspector, and eventually as a technical writer for defense contractors, always maintaining a low profile about her wartime service. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Claudia became more willing to discuss her experiences, seeing them as relevant to contemporary struggles for equality and justice. She spoke at churches and community centers, wrote articles for African American newspapers, and testified before congressional committees about discrimination in military service. She argued that her wartime experience demonstrated conclusively that African Americans and women could perform at the highest levels in any field, if given equal opportunity, and she challenged military and civilian authorities to provide such opportunities. Her testimony contributed to ongoing debates about military integration and equal rights, providing concrete evidence of capability and competence in the face of persistent discrimination. In 1967, Claudia was invited to return to the Soviet Union as part of a cultural exchange program, celebrating the 25th anniversary of wartime cooperation between Allied nations. She traveled to Moscow, where she was reunited with Yekaterina Volkov, whom she had not seen in person for 22 years. The reunion was emotional and was documented by both Soviet and American journalists, providing one of the few visual records of their partnership. During this visit, Claudia visited the Central Women's Sniper Training School, which still operated though with greatly reduced scope, and she spoke to current students about tactical methodology and psychological warfare. She also met with former comrades and students, many of whom had achieved significant success in military or civilian careers, and she visited memorials honoring the millions who had died during the conflict. The technical methodology Claudia developed continued to be taught and refined long after the war ended. Military analysts recognized that her fake miss strategy was applicable far beyond sniping, representing a fundamental principle of tactical deception. An enemy who believes you are incompetent will behave differently and often more carelessly than one who respects your capabilities. This principle has been applied to intelligence operations, cyber warfare, business competition, and negotiation strategy. The core insight that temporary acceptance of apparent failure can create opportunities for greater success has become a recognized component of strategic thinking across many fields. Academic papers and case studies have analyzed her operation, often without knowing her name, as an example of exceptional tactical creativity and psychological warfare. The broader implications of her service extend to questions of recognition and historical memory. Despite her extraordinary achievements, Claudia Reeves remained largely unknown outside of specialized military circles for most of her life. She was not featured in popular histories of the war, did not receive American military recognition, and faced decades of skepticism and dismissal when she tried to share her story. This neglect reflects broader patterns in how history is recorded and remembered, patterns that often marginalize the contributions of women, minorities, and those who served in unconventional or controversial roles. The fact that her story is not widely known says less about its significance than about whose stories are considered worth preserving and celebrating. In 1983, Claudia suffered a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed and limited her ability to speak. She spent her remaining years in a nursing facility in Philadelphia, cared for by family members, and occasionally visited by military historians and researchers who had discovered her story. She died on July 12, 1991, at the age of 69, having lived long enough to see the end of the Cold War tensions that had complicated so much of her post-war life. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was brief, noting her work in defense manufacturing and her community activism, but mentioning her wartime service only in passing, describing her as someone who had served in auxiliary roles during the conflict, a characterization that dramatically understated her actual achievements. It was only in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as military archives became more accessible and historians began systematically researching women's contributions to the conflict, that Claudia's full story began to emerge. Researchers discovered her training records at the OSS facility in Virginia, her service documentation in Soviet military archives, and the technical manuals that incorporated her tactical innovations. They found Yekaterina Volkov's detailed notes and sketches, preserved in Russian military museums, providing unprecedented documentation of sniper operations from the perspective of the participants themselves. They located after-action reports and intelligence assessments that confirmed the tactical and psychological impact of her operations. Gradually, piece by piece, her story was reconstructed, revealing an achievement that was remarkable not only for its tactical success, but for what it demonstrated about human capability, strategic thinking, and the costs of discrimination. The fake miss operation outside Smolensk in October 1943 represents a convergence of multiple themes: individual excellence achieving extraordinary results, the power of patience and psychological insight over immediate gratification, the effectiveness of women and minorities in roles traditionally denied to them, and the costs of societal discrimination in terms of both justice and practical effectiveness. It demonstrates that warfare is not merely about weapons and courage, but about understanding, psychology, and the ability to think several steps ahead of one's opponent. It shows that the most effective strategies often require accepting short-term costs for long-term gains, enduring misunderstanding and criticism while pursuing a vision that others cannot yet see. The soldiers who were trained by Claudia during her months as an instructor carried her lessons throughout the rest of the war and into their subsequent lives. One of her students, Marina Sokolova, achieved more than 40 confirmed results using variations of the fake miss strategy, and she later became a training instructor herself, teaching Claudia's methods to another generation. Another student, Anna Petrova, survived the war and became a military psychologist, applying the psychological principles Claudia had taught to broader questions of training, morale, and combat effectiveness. These women and dozens of others represented a multiplier effect, where one person's innovation could influence thousands, demonstrating how individual excellence can have impact far beyond personal achievement. The question of why Claudia's story remained obscure for so long reveals uncomfortable truths about historical memory and recognition. Her service did not fit convenient narratives. She was a black woman in an era when both facts limited recognition. She served with Soviet forces at a time when that association was politically problematic. and her achievements were in a domain, sniping and tactical deception, that society preferred not to think about too carefully. Moreover, her success implicitly challenged fundamental assumptions about who could excel in military service, raising questions about the costs of discrimination policies that excluded millions of capable people from service or relegated them to support roles. It was easier, in many ways, to simply not tell her story than to confront what her story revealed about institutional prejudice and lost potential. Modern military training now incorporates many of the principles Claudia developed, though often without attribution to her specifically. Sniper training emphasizes psychological warfare and tactical deception alongside marksmanship. Intelligence training includes extensive study of perception management and the deliberate cultivation of enemy assumptions. Special operations forces study historical cases of unconventional tactics, including operations that achieve disproportionate results through creativity and patience rather than overwhelming force. The fake miss strategy appears in case studies and training scenarios, demonstrating to new generations of military professionals that the most powerful weapon is often not the one fired, but the mind that chooses when and how to fire it. The relationship between Claudia and Yekaterina exemplifies how partnership and trust can multiply individual capabilities. Neither woman could have achieved what they did alone. Claudia provided the tactical vision and marksmanship skills, but Yekaterina provided the detailed observation, documentation, cultural knowledge, and local expertise that made that vision executable. They developed communication methods that transcended language barriers, trust that allowed them to endure weeks of extreme discomfort in close proximity, and mutual respect that acknowledged each other's contributions. Their partnership demonstrated that effective military operations depend not only on individual excellence, but on relationships built on trust, shared purpose, and complementary skills. The fact that they maintained correspondence for decades after the war suggests that their bond went far beyond professional necessity, becoming a deep friendship forged in extreme circumstances. The physical and psychological costs of their service cannot be overlooked. Claudia's frostbite left her with chronic pain and mobility limitations for the rest of her life. The psychological burden of observing and engaging targets at intimate distance, combined with the stress of operating behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, created trauma that she carried long after the war ended. Yekaterina lost her entire immediate family during the war and returned to a city that had been devastated by siege, facing grief and trauma that shaped the rest of her life. Both women demonstrated extraordinary resilience, channeling their experiences into contributions to training, education, and advocacy. But the costs they paid deserve recognition alongside celebration of their achievements. Service in warfare, even successful service, exacts tolls that last a lifetime, and honoring their achievements requires acknowledging those costs honestly. The technological context of Claudia's operation is worth noting. She achieved her results with equipment that was technologically inferior to what her opponents possessed, using a rifle and scope that were heavier, less accurate, and more difficult to operate than the German equipment. This fact makes her achievement even more remarkable, demonstrating that technological superiority can be overcome by tactical creativity and psychological insight. Modern military forces, with their emphasis on technological advantage, can learn from this example that technology alone does not determine outcomes, that human factors such as intelligence, discipline, and creativity remain decisive even in the age of advanced weapons systems. The most sophisticated equipment in the world cannot compensate for poor tactics or flawed psychology, while relatively simple equipment in skilled and creative hands can achieve extraordinary results. The fake miss operation occurred during a period when the war's outcome was still very much in doubt. In October 1943, the Soviet forces had achieved significant victories, including at Stalingrad earlier that year, but German forces still controlled vast territories and possessed formidable military capabilities. Every operation that degraded German effectiveness, disrupted their logistics, or reduced their morale contributed to an eventual outcome that was not yet certain. Claudia's operation, while small in scale compared to massive battles involving millions of soldiers, represented exactly the kind of tactical innovation and psychological warfare that could tip balances in a conflict where both sides were pushing the limits of their resources and endurance. Small advantages accumulated across thousands of individual operations created the conditions for larger strategic successes. The intersection of race, gender, and military service in Claudia's story provides important historical context for understanding broader social changes. Her service occurred during a period when American military forces were still segregated, when women were excluded from combat roles, and when prevailing social attitudes held that both groups were incapable of effective combat service. Her achievements, and those of hundreds of thousands of other women and minority service members across all Allied nations, provided empirical evidence that these attitudes were simply wrong, that capability was not determined by race or gender, but by training, opportunity, and individual qualities. This evidence contributed to social and political changes that eventually led to integration of military forces and expansion of opportunities, though these changes came slowly and incompletely, often requiring decades of advocacy and struggle. The ethical dimensions of sniper operations deserve careful consideration. Snipers engage targets at a distance, often with extensive preparation and detailed knowledge of their targets as individual humans, creating ethical questions that differ from other forms of combat. Claudia approached these questions with seriousness, recognizing that her targets were human beings, fathers and sons, products of their societies and circumstances, not inherently evil but caught in conflicts larger than themselves. She justified her actions by the defensive nature of the war, by the fact that the German forces of that era were invading Soviet territory and committing massive atrocities against civilian populations, and by her belief that effective military operations could save the lives of her comrades and hasten the end of the conflict. These justifications are not simple or absolute, and she struggled with the ethical weight of her actions throughout her life, a struggle that reflects moral seriousness rather than weakness. The documentation preserved by Yekaterina Volkov provides historians with an invaluable resource for understanding sniper operations from the perspective of participants rather than commanders. Her detailed notes, sketches, and observations offer insights into the daily reality of these operations. The boredom and discomfort, the constant tension between patience and urgency, the technical details of fieldcraft and camouflage, the decision-making process in selecting and engaging targets. These documents have been digitized and are now available to researchers, contributing to a more complete and accurate understanding of how these operations were actually conducted, as opposed to how they were idealized in propaganda or misunderstood by those who never experienced them directly. The transformation of Claudia's reputation from dismissed incompetent to recognized innovator occurred in a matter of hours on October 20th, 1943. But the broader recognition of her achievement took decades and remains incomplete even now. This pattern reflects how innovation is often initially misunderstood, how breaking from established doctrine can result in criticism and skepticism until results demonstrate the value of new approaches. It also reflects how institutional recognition often lags behind actual achievement, how bureaucracies and hierarchies are slow to acknowledge excellence that occurs outside established channels or is demonstrated by people from marginalized groups. The delay in recognition represents not just individual injustice, but institutional failure to learn from and disseminate valuable innovations as quickly as possible. The psychological warfare aspects of Claudia's operation had effects far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German soldiers across multiple units became hypervigilant about sniper threats, reducing their effectiveness and increasing their psychological burden. This fear could not be addressed through technological solutions or tactical doctrine because its source was not external threat, but internal uncertainty. Soldiers could never be certain whether apparently incompetent enemy fire was actually incompetent or was another instance of the fake miss strategy, could never know whether they were truly safe or were being observed and studied by an enemy who was deliberately holding fire. This uncertainty created psychological costs that affected morale, decision-making, and combat effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify but were nonetheless real and significant. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.